Hi,
Hey, how are you?
I'm good and you?
Very well, thank you. So thanks so much for joining this morning. This is an episode of E-WERK's program called Artists as Consultants. Our conversation is titled Coexistence in the Age of Collapsing Ecosystems. And thanks so much for taking part.
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
Sure, and thank you to E-WERK's Artistic Director, Helen Turner, for the invitation. Yeah, I suppose just for a bit of context, so we met about a year ago, just over a year ago, I believe. It would have been March or April 2019.
Yeah.
And I came to your studio to do a studio visit and also an interview for the magazine I worked for at the time. I remember you were preparing for the Venice Biennale, amongst other things, where you were taking part in the performance program that was curated by the Delfina Foundation. And we talked about many different things that day, kind of from Michael Jackson to the memory of water, and also kind of systems of oppression and abuse. And a number of these things have kind of sort of stuck with me. And so when we kind of started thinking about this program, this conversation, I was very curious to kind of come back to you and kind of reflect on some of these topics. And there was one thing in particular that kind of caught my attention is a letter which you recently wrote, an open letter, I believe we could call it that, titled "The Year I Stopped Making Art," which you wrote in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, which was originally published on the website Documentations, I believe is what it's called, and has since kind of gone various places. Oh, sorry, that's my dog. Sorry. And I believe you're now also curating a show in Paris that shares the same title. And I was really sort of curious to talk a little bit more about this letter, which I found so poignant, which essentially kind of addresses different sort of things, but overall kind of addresses disparity and inequality in the art world and in the institutional sector. So before we talk about this, and I want to hear more about how this letter came about, but I thought to give a little bit of context to our viewers, I thought I would read a short extract of the letter, and I obviously encourage everybody, if they haven't done so yet, to go and read the letter. We'll make sure there's a link available somewhere on this page. Also, I'll just say that the reason why I'm reading this extract and not you is because we had previously talked about it, and you kind of pointed to me that you preferred to not read it and not kind of have your voice directly associated to the letter, because I suppose it doesn't belong to you, but you can talk about that more in a minute. So here we go. The year I stopped making art was the year I became a single parent. It was 1622. I got enslaved and was taken by force to North America to work in a field. It was 2003, and I had to travel to another country to get an abortion. The year I stopped making art was 1997, when I had to save thousands from my tritherapy and to provide for my mother, who had just lost a job. It was 2017, when I fell short of money to pay for the registration fee of the photo contest, of the art residency, of the entrance exam at a prestigious uni. The year I stopped making art, I just stopped. I wasn't just being slowed down in my progress. I didn't take a detour. It just stopped. Life didn't throw me curveballs, at least not more than usual. My whole life felt like a curveball. I had no more stamina, not a single drop of blood left. My body collapsed. That's the year when I couldn't hold it together any longer. You failed me. So this is a short extract of the letter, and there's much more to it. So maybe Paul, if you could tell us a little bit about how the letter came about and what was your feeling at the time and your intention and what were you kind of hoping to create with this letter?
Yeah, sure. But first of all, it was something that I wrote um, in a bit of a rush. I was just returning to the UK from a trip, and then just in a span of a night, all my performances and exhibitions were cancelled, and I kind of quickly started to have a dialogue with friends of mine, artists a little bit everywhere, and trying to figure out how we could address art institutions. And we felt that it was a really important moment for them to understand that they could support artists beyond representation or beyond, you know, exhibiting them, because at the time there was also all those alternative online thing that started to pop up everywhere. And so it was the very, very beginning. I think it was around mid-March, a bit before mid-March. And I at first thought that I would just send this text to my contact list. Honestly, it was literally just me trying to address that with the people that I was working with and getting paid for the work I'd done, but couldn't be paid because the performance was cancelled or postponed and so on. But moreover, I think this moment really made me realize how much precarity was existing, and like how like some of my friends, artists or not, or people who were artists and had to stop, were rendered invisible, completely like erased from this. And I was very aware of the people that I was working with not being necessarily concerned or realizing the danger of this and the danger of this gig-based economy where you feel that you are, for example, in my case, I was like touring quite a lot, performing, exhibiting, and you have a sense of like establishing a sort of like a financial stability, and then when everything is removed, you realize that actually you don't have any support, and especially if you don't have generational wealth or superstructure that is in place, so that in the event of a cancellation or something, then you're still able to sustain a living. I think it was really important for me to do that. And when I wrote it, it was this idea of kind of embodying different voices. So that's also why I didn't want necessarily my voice to be attached to it. I had like ever since it's been published, I had like multiple invitation to make a reading, and I always said no, because it was first and foremost something that I wanted for people to use as well as a tool. So when it got published by documentation.art, which is this French website, French website, which is kind of doing like a very important work of looking at the art world through like a very kind of critical and analytical point of view in terms of how it operates and how people move inside that financially, but not only. So that was the first time that they published something, a text that wouldn't be necessarily like an inquiry into a specific issue. And I was completely like, overwhelmed by the positive response, and then how it got republished. And so I was really happy about that, and also got translated in like several languages, which was nice, and not necessarily by art institutions.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's great. And I suppose, you know, I mean, there's so much to that letter, and I really find it so incredible and poignant. And I think for me, there's, you know, what really kind of interests me is, I mean, you kind of evoked the sort of deployment of the different, you know, the deployment of the first person. There's also this kind of this interesting mode of address to the second person. So in the extract that I read, which kind of ends with "you failed me," which is kind of the moment where you introduce us the second person. Can you tell me about what you had in mind? Who is this you are addressing?
The you, in the same way as the I and the we, is multiple. It's not necessarily one person. But it's more like I think this was for me a way to address directly institutions, but in a way that felt like almost addressing a specific person. And because for me, it was really important to remember and to remind people of the fact that there are people behind institutions. There are people, there are artists' lives, can be, even using artists. I just wanted to talk about people, basically. And we tend to forget about that in the art world, where, there's a lot of assumptions about art. As soon as you are an artist and you can make a living of it, you are falling into the bourgeois class almost, like, or there's those assumptions about the way you live and the way you may operate in the world. And so in the same way, the institution can be also almost like a smokescreen or a shield for people to hide behind a bigger structure, not realizing that some personal decisions are made and these should be held accountable. So that was a way for me to do that. But the you is definitely multiple as much as the I and the we.
Yeah. And speaking of the we, to me this kind of reminds me of the notion of being singular plural that was sort of developed by the French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy, in which he kind of roughly talks about the idea of the I always being social and always existing with another, and therefore the I being sort of impossible without the we. And there's an extract, there's a moment in the letter where you sort of quote the you in saying, "I'm sorry to hear you're experiencing difficulties. It's a tough time for us all," you said. "I wondered who you meant when you were saying us, because I didn't feel like a part of your we," which I find very strong. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about this kind of idea of I suppose, the limitations or the shortcomings of the we.
Yes, it's something that I've also used in my work quite a bit, because I'm always struck at how we are talking about we, like like the community or the audience as this kind of homogeneous group of people. And I find this use of the we almost like a form of gaslighting, because it kind of make you feel that you should be part of something, or that there is a proximity and a sameness between the two of us, let's say. But it erases any kind of potential power dynamic in terms of like class, gender, race, even like sexuality, all those the use of the we. I find it like troubling sometimes, because it's a way again to hide behind something that prevents us from addressing the real issue, the deeper stuff, the thing that lurks in the shadow image, not the image, what we see, but what's actually behind it, what's almost like the mirror image of what is presented to us. And I think it's something that I've always tried to dismantle in my work, and really it's a way for me to just come to, for example, performances, or to produce exhibitions in an unassuming way, and always trying to kind of acknowledge the fact that not everybody is going to have the same experience of a show, of a performance, because we are all coming to this with a set of experience that is informing the way we experience the work, or like a situation. So and in turns it requires us to make more effort on the, you know, like, to make sure that on the receiving end, no violence is produced. And erasure is one of the violence that is so tricky to dismantle, and because there is this history of in the West of erasing and kind of extracting and deflecting almost, instead of really going in and addressing and looking at the wound, you know.
Yeah. And this actually kind of brings us to another topic that I wanted to discuss with you, which is kind of overall the idea of memorial culture, although that's quite broad. And in fact, since we last spoke, so much has happened. And as you were talking, I was just thinking about, you know, the continued protests at Tate, for instance, which is currently, you know, about to possibly cut up to 200 jobs of those who are most likely to be, you know, employees on precarious contracts, and also most likely to be the employees of color as opposed to white employees. So a lot of those tensions are very much kind of at the forefront right now, and very much being kind of scrutinized, and there's a real kind of sense of revolt, I think. And when we first started talking about this conversation, the context was it was already looking pretty kind of tense, but it was a little bit different. I think the week that we started talking was the week that the statue of Edward Colston in Brighton came down, and
Bristol,
I thought it was,
right?
say,
Bristol, right?
Bristol. Did I say Brighton?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, Bristol.
Thinking of
Apologies, Bristol. And you know, I thought it was interesting that you know, they took it down and then they threw it back to the sea, and well, to the river, to the water, and I thought that was kind of interesting because you know, I was kind of thinking about some of the conversations that we had about the memory of water, and I know that hydrofeminism is kind of a topic that's been important and influential in your work. And so it kind of got me thinking about, you know, memorial culture and the idea of how are things remembered, and in what capacity, and in what kind of material context. And I wonder if you could kind of speak to this idea of the kind of monument, the statue, the edifice, but then kind of it's being absorbed into water, what that might mean in terms of collective memory, what that can mean in terms of erasure or visibility or lack of visibility. I wonder how that kind of speaks to you.
Yeah, it's a big thing. And I think what we are witnessing right now is, so I could feel already that the structures were shaken, or were shaking already kind of last year. In the last like 3 years, I felt that happening, but I never thought that they would actually collapse. They've actually fall into the water. I think there's several things. In terms of those monuments, I think they definitely speak very directly to the idea of erasure, because they leave us with the idea, or lead us to believe that, one, history is fixed, two, that there is a singular version of that history, and three, that everything can be articulated like visually, that the, you know, representation is the thing that for me is almost like becoming an impairment to our deep understanding. And especially in situation of oppression, we tend to forget that if something is invisible to you, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And that's something that for me is almost like the perfect definition of privilege, which is this blind spot, and people kind of using this it's almost like a blind spot with agency. Like you can use it, or you can weaponize it in a way to render something invisible to others as well. And so by toppling them and then by throwing them to the water, I think there was something also quite ironic in that. It's almost as if, you know, the the slave master was kind of going to be receiving a very hard welcome committee once under the sea, you know, and maybe
Right.
like being greeted by all the dead, you know, black slaves that were thrown to the water. So there was kind of, this felt like almost comical to me, this kind of karma wheel happening to those sculptures, monuments. But moreover, I think it's like, I have always kind of felt that I was a little bit of an iconoclast. I always felt that I was always mistrustful of images because they are so misleading, and they are, again, like a distraction for me most of the time. And yeah, I think it's like, it's for now more than ever, it's for us to stay very clear-headed and clear-minded about what we are presented with, and but also like the image that we reproduce. And so I guess like this moment of taking them down is very, very, very important. And I'm kind of struggling to even like speak to that, because I think there's so much to talk about, and there is so much that is yet to happen. I don't know what's gonna, you know, because it could totally be that there is a reversal in the process as well, and that what you expect would happen, and this kind of revisiting history through maybe different type of narratives and different voices can also go in another direction, where conservatism is kind of appropriating those gestures in a discourse,
Right.
which is already happening. Like,
Right. With Mark Quinn, I suppose, is a
exactly.
kind of an
And
interesting example.
yeah, so that's the danger of our time. And I think it's like those heightened tensions that were already present, you know, like, for example, what was baffling to me was all like the Black Lives Matter statements produced by various like organizational bodies and stuff, as if they were almost like discovering racism right
Right.
now. And that's how I felt. And that felt like hurtful in a way, because it's almost as if people needed to see the death of George Floyd in a very, very crude and vivid way in order to understand that it was like this, you know, type of death was unjustified, was, you know, needed to be stopped. This kind of violence perpetuated by the state basically onto Black people. And it's again, it's going back to this blind spot and what is kind of lurking in the deeper stuff. Like, we need that. We need to look at things by not looking at them, but by like maybe feeling them a bit more, maybe like giving way to more irrational, or not irrational, but a thinking that is kind of standing outside of this like rational framework that the West is being kind of nurturing for so many centuries.
And I wonder if kind of because we've evoked the idea of hydrofeminism, which is quite a, I mean, can be a sort of complex sort of notion, and in a way, I was thinking about the beginning of our conversation with the letter and the deployment of the I in the first person. And I was thinking about the kind of parallel, the idea of the multiplicity of the I, and you know, hydrofeminism kind of relying on this idea that we are all kind of bodies of water, which in a way there's kind of a connection there. I wonder if you can sort of speak a little bit about your interest in hydrofeminism and how you see that perhaps kind of possibly answering some of that tension, or helping us maybe navigate some of these limitations.
Yeah, Hydrofeminism by Astrid Anemenis is a text that was passed on to me by my friend and collaborator, Sophie Mallet. And there was a moment when I started to kind of like look into the memory of water and its kind of emotional responsiveness and all these instances where the boundaries between, or the hierarchies between nature and culture, the mind and the body were kind of blurred, or almost, I wanted to say, queered in a way. And so, but at first it was a very personal quest. It was kind of me trying to understand how my desire was working, and it was more of something that it's often the case actually in my work. It's like sometimes it can come across as like research heavy, although it's really not. It's like most of the time I'm using materials and theory to understand stuff that happened in my life. It's really a weird kind of process that I'm coming to realize just now. But so hydrofeminism was a way for me to think about opposition outside, or like resistance outside of oppositional situation. So how not to be always resistant by being in opposition to something. So that's when I started to think about water as a way to, for example, I don't know, because at the time I was feeling that I was kind of hitting a wall or trying to destroy a wall that was way too big, way too strong for me. So how to use like strategies that water can use in order to tear down this wall. And so kind of infiltration, leaking into one another. And then that's when I started to be interested in how, in a way, our bodies are communicating without, speaking necessarily, or how like the waters of our bodies could also interact, through sweat, through orgasm, through a lot of other stuff. And that's kind of when I started to speculate about the fact that maybe the waters of our body were containing stories, because there was this thing that at the time I was working on, also like trying to look at the body as an archive and what was contained in my body and where this archive was located. And then at some point I speculated that it was probably inside my waters in a way. And that this water was composed of others' waters. And so it's kind of like going back to this idea of fluidity and circulation, as well as this multiplicity, how many can we be in one body? That's something that has been kind of occupying my thoughts like for a long time. How are my multiple selves coexisting? And I guess like the text is actually, I think it's available online, and I would encourage everybody to read it, because there are parts of it that I find extremely poignant and relevant to our era, and to understand, because it's kind of addressing sameness, or like a sense of commonality that is not becoming a synonym of universalism, or like when Astrid Anemenis talk about our common connection to water, and this kind of constant need to return to water, and this interaction between the sea and us, or this oceanic being that we are, it's never like something that is again homogenizing. And that's the thing that is interesting about this element, because it's composed of like billions of molecules that are all interacting and working together, but are separate in a way. And so I guess that's something that I've been sticking with me for a while.
And the theory of water memory, I think is it Luc Montagnier, is that his name? who put it forward, and who was also one part of the team who kind of discovered, or at least sort of theorized and scientificized the virus, the HIV virus.
Yes, yeah.
And I remember talking about that with you last year, that I think when he first sort of presented his theory of water memory, it was kind of ridiculed by the scientific community.
Yeah, yeah.
It was seen as this kind of new age thing that sort of had no scientific ground, which is interesting. And it's funny because last year at the Venice Biennale, I was kind of writing something that was about water, the theme of water, and I went to meet scientists, a German scientist called Georg Gisser, who is an oceanographer based in Venice. And out of curiosity, I asked him if he knew of water memory, because I was just curious to hear from a scientist what sort of his thoughts were. And he'd never heard of it, surprisingly. But then his response, I thought, was really curious, because I kind of asked him about water memory and sort of named a scientist. I kind of gave him a bit of context. And he was like, I've never heard of it, but I work with the memory of water all the time, because he was saying, you know, in studying, so his expertise is, he's an expert in lagoons, and so he studies the lagoon of Venice, and he's quite a sort of very outspoken in terms of the state of the lagoon and the risks of it's essentially being kind of destroyed or being transformed into something else. And he was telling me that a lot of his research is actually based on kind of the study of data that is kind of embodied within the water. So it was funny to hear him say, I've never heard of that theory, but I work with the memory of water. All my work is based on that. So I thought that was interesting. And something else that was interesting to me, which relates to this conversation and perhaps can kind of take us to the sort of conclusion part of this conversation, is I remember when working on this piece, what I thought was interesting is that I spent some time with him, this oceanographer in Venice, and then I also spoke extensively to an art historian called Caroline Jones, and who's kind of specializes in the history of biennials, etc. Because I was curious to hear from her the kind of the idea of the biennial and the art world as an ecosystem. And so what was interesting is to both hear them talk about ecosystems in ways that were actually surprisingly similar, even though they were obviously coming from radically different perspectives and talking about radically different things. But they both seem to kind of relate to this idea of the ecosystem in fairly similar ways. And so I think maybe to kind of slowly kind of leads to our conclusion, because obviously the title of our conversation was Coexisting in the Age of Collapsing Ecosystems. Now that we've kind of talked a bit about coexistence, how can we start talking and thinking about coexistence and the deployment of the I's and the kind of shortcomings of the we in the context of ecosystems, and ecosystems that, as we are witnessing right now, are indeed collapsing, I believe, or at least very close to collapse.
I think one of the things that we should start to do is like to understand ourselves as an ecosystem, which means that there is an interconnectedness, and we are all necessary to one another. And I think that's, moreover, I mean, it's a very cheesy thing to say, but it's also very true. And I think most of the oppression, most of the toxicity that we may experience or we may generate is coming from a place where we think of ourselves as separate entities, as separate elements that are sharing a space, but not necessarily are in relation. And I think that's for me, that's fundamental. And that's why, like, during the lockdown, I kind of rewatched this documentary about Edward Colston by Mantia Diawara, and it was, I mean, Edward Colston is someone that is a bit of an icon to me, you know, alongside like Audre Lorde and other people that I've been reading kind of like throughout the years, and or Fred Moten and stuff, where there is this importance to given to poetry and to a thinking that is embedded in a very concrete violence and very concrete context, and yet is not afraid to be exceeding it, like to be exceeding it by bringing in like notions that are a little bit more emotional, a bit more in touch with what is felt. And I think it's like, it's something very important in this idea of like coexisting, because coexistence also implies circulation. It implies balancing out. It implies a whole set of parameters and conditions for the ecosystem to be healthy in a way. And I think that's why it's important to think of ourselves as a collective of some sort, but a collective that, again, is not homogenizing, a collective that is probably in conflict, that can clash, that is not obsessed with the idea to be harmonious as well. And I think it's like what I felt even more strongly, like during this lockdown and these months where I was isolated and alone for most of the time. It was this kind of importance to kind of also position myself as an artist differently, and to also start to speak from a place where I'm not necessarily subjected to the institutions or the organization rules, and it can also be a dialogue, and it has to be a dialogue, because what I've witnessed is also like this institutional panic at the beginning of the lockdown, where all the content was removed from them, and so they started to kind of again resort to artists to find solutions. And I think a lot of artists, at least people that I know, refuse to occupy this position, because we all realized that up until now we were not considered as almost as important. And this, for me, this is like also interesting to see the museum shaking, because there's no more artists like to feed it, and so all the jobs that are related to that are unfortunately affected. But it's also because it's a reminder that without the artist, like, those structure cannot exist. And often in the way that artists are treated and almost, I wanted to say, used in some instances, it's not a reflection of that. You always have the feeling that you are like the last to get paid, the last to be considered, and not in all cases, but most of the time it's like it's a very recurring thing. And I think it's not even specific to to the art world necessarily, but like creative industry in general. Whenever someone is at like the forefront of something, like visually, like the thing that you see is actually not the thing that is important in a way, like, or it's not the thing that is taken care of. Like, I don't know, if you look at, I don't know, the other day I had this conversation with a friend of mine who was working for this big fashion brand, and is an artistic director, and so is like deciding of everything. And there was this superstar, a Black woman, that was featuring in the campaign. And this decision was made also in the follow-up to the Black Lives Matter movement, kind of in this moment. And yet this supermodel, like, he was kind of in a chain of email where the executive were addressing an issue because the supermodel was wearing braids, and that was not really a reflection of the brand or like what they wanted. And so those
Right.
braids, all in a sudden, this dark-skinned woman became even more like dangerous or irrelevant because she was not wearing the look or the type of hair they wanted her to wear. And this felt too, I don't know, they didn't even like describe what they felt, but there was an issue.
Yeah.
And the decision fell onto my friend to say, basically, who's a person of color, to say, am I really witnessing this conversation right now?
Right.
This person is coming tomorrow and I'm shooting her as she is. We're not removing her
Yeah.
braids. But it's so, I mean, it's a bit of an anecdotal thing, but just to say that you would assume, seeing this picture, that, and knowing this person, that it's impossible, that she's met with still like a racism in a way. But no matter how big you are, how visible you are, exposure never ever ever protects you from oppression and from discrimination. And so that's why I'm always trying to address that with the person I'm working with, and even me as an artist, like trying to also kind of dissent almost this obsession for the visual, for, you know, people who want to see me perform and not other performing my work, you know, like those kind of things I think are important to discuss.
Did your friend manage to get it their way, or were they able to shoot it?
Yeah, of course, because they were totally embarrassed, and then, you know, like this group of 7 white people and this person of color, you know, but luckily my friend is in a position of like very powerful position, is in a position to do so. But for me it was insane. And so I'm sure, and luckily I think the model was never aware of this conversation going on. But it's still it shows us how if we are not starting to speak up, to address things as a group, how what's really happening under the surface is way it's still very, very ingrained and still very much happening. And this idea, so let sorry, I'm like losing my words right now. But I think it's important for us, to remain clear-minded and not be fooled by images and by why it's presented to us. And what's visible is not necessarily what's happening. It's only a part of it.
God, absolutely. No, I'm just thinking, because as somebody who works in the media, I mean, that kind of incident, I've heard so many variations of that incident, and I've been exposed to it, and I've been in very kind of unpleasant kind of situations, which in the past has also led me to resign from jobs, because if you like, it's like many, I mean, the media, like many, like is still, it's designed by and for certain people, which are clearly white people, and their taste and their preference, and you'd be surprised how still to this day those conversations will be had behind closed doors by groups of white people who literally will not even realize or begin to sort of think about how fucked it is until you tell them so. And even when you tell them so, it's can easily be brushed under the carpet. So it's well, I'm glad that your friend was in a position, because it's not always the case that there's actually somebody in a position
But it's
say
also,
something and make
again,
change.
it's also a violence for him as a person of color to have
Right,
to,
right. Yeah,
step into those shoes and be like the one to tell off people, to reestablish the truth, almost, not the truth,
yeah,
but to reestablish like a fairer environment. And
yeah.
it's a lot of like emotional labor as well to take in and
Sure,
to just
sure.
process. That's what's
Absolutely.
toxic.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. Um, all right. Well, I think we've covered a lot of things. I think we come getting to the end of
Mm-hmm.
our allocated time. There is because you kind of talked about Edward Colston, and you talked about the importance of poetics, and that kind of made me think that I've got in my notes, I've got a quote highlighted, which is from the text, which you kindly shared with me, the hydrofeminism essay, which I very much enjoyed. Thank you for sending that. And there was a quote by Adrienne Rich, the American poet, which I thought was particularly suited to this conversation, which says, "The problem was that we did not know whom we meant when we said we," which I think kind of resonates greatly with some of the stuff that we talked about, particularly in the context of your letter. So maybe to end the conversation, and I know you are curating a show at Galerie Sultana in Paris, which is titled after the letter, the year I
Not
stopped.
after the letter,
Oh,
but
okay, sorry.
I'll
All
speak
right.
about it. Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe to kind of end the conversation, if you want to say something about the exhibition and what it is, and maybe kind of, kind of close on the idea of the we, if there's anything else to say.
Yeah, so the show is called Yesent. So
Mm.
it's kind of like a way of saying yes by saying no, no, a way of saying no by saying yes. So
Mm.
so Guillaume Zultana, the director of the gallery, invited me to co-curate this project that he wanted to put together in order to redistribute funds to artists who have suffered from like the consequences of COVID, basically, but were not eligible to the governmental scheme in France.
Yeah.
And so we kind of try to find hardship funds or people who were already existing, and a structure that was already existing, and were able to redistribute those funds. So the idea is for to support the artists that are part of the show, as well as art students that were not, that like who lost their jobs or were not in a position to receive any money from the government. And I'm very pleased of how the project turned out. And it's going to be now like divided in 2 chapters. So there will be a first chapter opening on the 10th of September, and then closing around the end of October. And then from the end of October till the end of the year, there will be a second chapter with more artists joining in, and also representing different works from the artists that were already participating in the first show. So all the infos are online, I think by now. And we went for people who we kind of like, one, admired, and two, who represent something important in the ways in which they use the practice, always in connection to a certain given like social context, but not in the most evident way. And these are people who are also occupying like gray areas in the way they live their lives. So some people are now dead. Some others stopped making art. Some others have kind of reoriented towards something else. So it's a lot of people who are, weirdly, some of them can come across as like super central in the art world and occupying this very visible position. Like, I don't know, I can think of like Anthea Hamilton or Candice Lynn, or Patrick Staff, but yet in the way they operate and then they've been operating for years and decades. They've always been at the periphery of things in a way, or and that was important. There are other people who are like not necessarily known at all, and it was kind of important for us to make them again like coexist, make their work coexist in a way that wouldn't feel like competitive or violent or in any ways. So it's a lot of dialogue with them. It's a lot of also kind of building a relationship of trust, because and I think it's like the guarantee of how good they are. It's like all of them are very concerned about how the work is shown and where. And so in general, in how they, you know, they are existing as artists. So it's an exciting project. And I was really happy for Guillaume to start that, as well as a commercial gallery, kind of providing help, financial help and support to the people who cannot have access to government money.
Super. And so that opens in
the 10th of September.
10th of
so
September.
Very soon. Yes.
Great. And the title is Yescent.
Yescent. Yes.
Right. So I got it wrong. Apologies.
No, it's because the year I stopped making art was the starting point of the reflection we had. But then I didn't want the text to be attached to that in such a direct way, because it tends to otherwise restrict people's like practices and I don't want to be in that type of dynamics.
All right. Well, looking forward to it. I hope I get to see it. I might do, because I have to get to Paris at some point in September, if I'm allowed, if anyone's allowed to leave their homes, really. All right. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thanks, Benoit.
That was really nice. I think we've covered it all. Was there anything else you wanted to say, or?
Not necessarily. Have a great end of the summer.
Yeah, you too. And hope to see you soon.
Yes.
All right.
Ciao.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.